You said in your lecture on Homo Economicus that you may have seen some connections between technology and our issues with sustainability. And my question for you is, how do you feel in terms of technology and science going to end up becoming our solution to our sustainability issues that we're running into, whether that's water, whether that's food, natural resources, etc.?
Another interesting question. I wouldn't say I'm a Luddite, but I do, I'm not somebody that takes the technology easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like anybody else. I reap the benefits of the luxuries of a lot of technological advancements. But I guess I just get concerned with this sort of fixation on technological advances as the solution to these very basic problems that we face. And it's almost like the struggles we face, there's kind of an avoidance of actually changing how we live, changing our lifestyle,
right,
or an avoidance of sort of looking in the mirror and accepting that this trajectory we on is not going to last.
Mm-hmm.
There's this like addiction to this next technological fix. And I saw a pretty funny thing online where there was an electric car
mm-hmm.
that was getting charged up by a diesel run generator that was in the back of a truck running on fuel, right? And all it said underneath was, "The future is stupid."
Yeah.
I don't know if what that has to do with what I'm talking about,
but it's funny.
It came to mind. But I guess in the mentorship that I've had, from the wise ones, it's just this message that not so much the solutions, but the things that need to happen are actually very self-evident,
right?
And they're quite simple, but they're simple in the sense that we know what they are, but they're not simple because it has to do with our willingness to change how we live,
mm-hmm.
and our willingness to make different decisions. And so that's why in that lecture I said they're cultural problems, they're spiritual problems. And I think that technology and our fixation on technology is actually part of the reason that it's such a fixation for humans, is that it's filling a void that's been left by our abandonment of spiritual practices and our abandonment of ways to find deeper meaning in our lives. And that's a symptom that I see in so many, especially undergrads that end up in my classroom, especially young women. They'll start to cry, and they'll apologize, and they'll be ashamed of crying, and they actually don't know why they're crying. And I can't say that I really understand it either, but I just think that there are many people that experience an emptiness
mm-hmm.
with what the current cultural preoccupations are, and how the latest technological advancement is supposed to fulfill us, and how that continually shows that that's actually not the case. And so one thing I'm really aware of, Keaton, is, and so here's a bit of an analysis that I would provide, is that, of course, there are many people whose ancestors came to this country generations ago.
Right.
So they know that, their ancestors came from, say, mostly somewhere in Europe, let's say. They know that, but it's not really very important to them anymore because they don't really have a connection to that place where their ancestors came from. So they consider themselves Canadian, if you ask them. But what's happened to the families, I would say, over several generations is that they've gradually been stripped of what made them unique and what gave them a sense of vitality as human beings in terms of identity. Mm-hmm. What they brought with them from their home country in terms of their spiritual practices, their cultural practices, their identity, and what made them strong. For many people, that's been stripped away. There are no remnants of that in anything that they do in their lives, except maybe something they eat, on a holiday. And so when they're in a situation where they're struggling, they have nothing to call upon to make them feel like their life has meaning.
Right.
And so in my view, when especially young women come into my classroom and I can share a little bit about the traditions from this place, it wakes up something inside of them that has been put to sleep. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the problem we face, is that, the way Homo Economicus works is that if you feel that emptiness, then go shopping, or, get this latest piece of technology, or be excited about whatever Elon Musk has invented, right? Because that's really that's the future. Mm-hmm. And so there's this emptiness that we face. And so I think there's going to be some kind of reckoning with all this, because people are starting to realize this emptiness and this loneliness.
Right. I think that's terrifying, if I'm being honest. The fact that people are more willing to solve a problem, there's an app for that. The next phone is coming out, etc., rather than look in. But one question that flew into my mind, that lack of connection to the spiritual and cultural practices of our heritage, what do you think has driven that? Do you think that is also attributed to the technological revolution? Or do you think there's another cause, or multiple other causes, Yeah,
multiple other causes. Yeah, I was just talking about technology and sort of I'll call it the worship of science and scientific innovation. But there's been a lot of oppression. There's been a lot of, the exercise of power and control under the guise of freedom. Right. And multiculturalism that's also done a lot of damage to people and their connections to what makes them well. That we have to account for sure. Yeah.
So, do you think that one of a practice that you would suggest in everyday life in general is actively searching for more about your heritage? Because, like, for me, for example, I am of Igbo descent on my father's side. On my mother's side, I am Canadian. And like you said, on that side of my family, there is little cultural and religious bits that I am informed about, but it's not like I've taken trips to where my family is from geographically in the world. And on my father's side of the family, they know quite a lot about their history, and they're very informed. So I don't know, it's very interesting to see the differences in where they come from.
Right. Maybe you've seen that show that's usually aired on PBS. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the host. It's called Finding Your Roots.
Okay. I might have encountered a little bit of it.
It's a total fabrication. It never happened.
So, it's mostly celebrities, like actors or musicians, or a lot of people that you know and recognize, but people who feel like they don't know a lot about their family background, and so the program does the research and reveals a lot of things to them that they just didn't know. Mm-hmm. And they're mostly Americans, and so there's a lot of really interesting insights that arise, and it's again very emotional for people, and so that's just an interesting one that I like to watch, because it just confirms I think one thing I've realized, and that is just how important it is for us as human beings to have a sense for who you are, who you come from, who your people are, and not so much in a conclusive way, or as a way to like declare and pound your fist on the table about this is who I am, but to know the stories and to know the connections and to understand who you come from is really a really important part of wellness, I would say, in being healthy as a human being. And just as an example, so my mom is Norwegian, so her family comes from Norway, and so I went there. The U of A has a partnership with a college north of Oslo, and they invited me to go over there, and so I went to the place where my ancestors are from, my Norwegian ancestors are from, and I got a chance to, because it's the first time I had visited that country, and I got a chance to just explore some of this, and I went to the little town that they're from, and every second mailbox had the family name on there. So I knew I was surrounded by these relatives that, I had never known. And of course, the irony is me looking the way I do, for me to say, I'm Norwegian. And a lot of people were kind of confused by that. But it just felt really good, for me to be there and to see those places and to think about those, my great grandparents and the trip they made across the ocean. All of that is part of me as well, right? And I just think for all of us, the good stories, the bad stories, it just gives you a better sense for what makes you up and how you've come to be who you are.
Right. So one last question concerning this topic. Do you think that it's possible, after being informed of who you are, to find your community elsewhere? Does your, say, religious, cultural, or racial background limit what you can explore and who you can become when it comes to exploring histories?
Yeah, I don't think so, to answer your question directly. I mean, I just think that we all have our differences, right? Despite being human beings, we all have our differences, and I just think that the better we're kind of connected and understand, not in a sort of an exclusive way, but in a way that sort of helps us be real human beings, then the healthier we are to sort of interact with others and just enhance well-being. I'll put it that way, instead of undermining or competing or bringing harm. That I just feel like if we're healthier inside in how we understand those things, then we're much better able to be good relatives. That's been my experience. Yeah, and so all these things I'm talking about, these connections to our own identities and our own traditions, I would think of those in sort of ethically relational ways, rather than as a way to separate into camps. Yeah, that's not sort of the vision that I'm working on.
No, and I think I could agree with that. I think it's very interesting. But I also think what makes our world beautiful is that everybody has a differing vision. Because your mission, Dwayne, could not be identical to mine, whether I liked it to be or not, because our subjective experience of life has been very, very different, right? So I think it's very valuable, and I think while I'm obviously a lot younger and a lot less educated, I'm positive that I can learn some things from you, but I am also very confident that you could learn some things from me, just because our experiences are so different, right?
Yeah, we're back to reciprocity. Yeah, and I don't want to make this too much of a Pocahontas moment here, Keaton, but I guess the way I've been taught is that you think of the most beautiful place that you've been, outside place that you've been, and think of all the life that's there, and all the trees, and maybe all the different bird sounds you hear, and all the different things that are going on there. And we would call that ecological diversity. Right. So this ecosystem is so beautiful. We love it because there's all kinds of different life there that's flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the teaching is if we find that so remarkably beautiful, why would we want human life to be any different from that? Why would we want humans to all be the same? That's just a crazy idea. And so my idea of diversity isn't really rooted in liberal democratic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It's more inspired by sacred ecology, wisdom teachings. And so, we need your different call. We need your presence. We need your wisdom. We need your life for everything else to be healthy. That's the way I see it. And that's what we can call ethical relationality.
There's a lot of words that you're throwing out here. I think it's awesome. It gives me stuff to learn about afterwards. Another thing that I wanted you to touch on, if you're available and willing, is the notions that you have concerning Western society and our beliefs, how, like you said in your lecture on Homo economicus, we have informed a society where there is a quote-unquote ideal human being and their value is intrinsically tied to their economic value, and how that has changed who we are as people and the way that we're living.
Yeah, well, it's just important for your listeners to know that I didn't invent that phrase, of course, Homo economicus. That comes from Karl Polanyi, who made that observation in, I think, 1949 in a book he wrote. And many different people have riffed off of it. And so, this is a phenomena that's been growing for decades, of course, and now we see it manifested. And some people would say that Homo economicus has now sort of evolved into something else. Maybe like there's something new that's arising, and people smarter than me might have something to say about that, right? That it's not simply just an economic person that we're dealing with anymore, or that's being promoted institutionally, I guess I could say. But I'm reluctant to use that phrase, the West, and I know it's quite common in academic circles and many people use it, but it kind of gives a bad name to a direction I happen to really like. But it also, I think, kind of simplifies, what the challenge is. And so I tend to, in response to your question, I tend to, my mind goes to colonialism and colonial worldview. And I think, the way I understand it is that after Columbus did what he did, and then all the different, nations started competing to control the places they encountered and the resources that they, were beginning to exploit, including humans, that this sort of race for control and to fulfill the doctrine of discovery, all of that stuff, what it resulted in is the sort of return to Europe of a lot of wealth, but also a tremendous amount of new information about people and the world. And so part of what was required was sort of an encyclopedic cataloging of all this stuff. And so this is relevant to us in education, because I would say that most of what happens in schools is a result of that cataloging. In other words, what teachers are told to teach is itemized based on what happened during that period into what we call the Enlightenment. And so it's really in the last, 400 years that what's taught in schools, that's what is worshipped, is what's happened mostly in Europe over the last 400 years. But one of the cultural habits or cultural assumptions that comes out of that is what I call relationship denial.
Mm-hmm.
So a key principle of colonial worldview is relationship denial. So it's this preoccupation with separating things out, with dividing the world according to certain principles or practices that are considered the most correct or the most logical or the most valid. If you follow me in the ways in which these Enlightenment philosophers and their influences kind of come into confluence to create this very powerful worldview that we in schools perpetuate.
Mm-hmm.
And so relationship denial manifests itself in many different ways, but I see this as a key part of what we might call the Western worldview. And so this, if I'm right, if relationship denial is a key part of the problem we face in terms of education, then the most important thing we can do is to try to repair the relationships that have been denied and then try to renew them on different terms.
Right.
Terms different from the Western worldview, I guess I would say, or the colonial worldview. So then my question is, as an educator, so if we're looking for different sources of inspiration, well, where might we look? Where might we find these sources of inspiration for how to do things differently? And as I've already said, we're surrounded by wisdom here in this part of the world. But of course, through colonial influences, we've been taught that it's irrelevant, or it's actually primitive, and can't help us, right? And so this is the legacy of all of this that I think we're trying to recover from now.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that I think it's very interesting that there can be such a divide. I don't want to call it a divide because I don't feel like there's one side versus the other, but there can be such a shift in people's thinking, and it can happen so quickly. Do you think it's vital for people to find instructors or knowledge holders, for lack of a better term, to come to terms with these type of things? Because in my experience, I don't think these are topics that we are going to just encounter in the normal curricular, at least the Albertan curricular experience in public education. Because if I didn't go out of my way to find somebody to ask these type of questions about relationality, relationships, not just with people, but with the planet and with our culture, with our religions, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one of the things I've learned is that for the most part, despite our best intentions, educational institutions and schooling practices are mostly conservative in what they do. Small c, conservative, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense that we try to name something that we think is going on, and then it shows up in a program of study, and by the time it shows up, it's usually too late,
right?
And something else has already happened. But I guess I would say, and this isn't, I would say, not the fault of anybody who works in schools necessarily. It's part of the culture, but they're not really places of creativity or innovation or experimentation. Mm-hmm. It's mostly very familiar and liking it that way, keeping it that way. And so, I think this is a major challenge we face, and this is what I say to teachers whenever I have a chance, is that if you're not willing to sort of begin to tinker with the structure of what you do, then you aren't going to have any cultural change.
Right.
There will be no cultural change without structural change. And so I would say most of the initiatives that I've seen that have failed have tried to bring about cultural change without actually changing the structures of what's done. And so when I talk about structures, what I mean is how is the day organized? How is the time used? How is knowledge understood? How is knowing understood? How are people expected to express what they know? These are all the structures that we encounter, that for the most part there's no negotiation about them. So what we experience is just information plugged into those existing structures, and it's just information.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really go anywhere.
So the information without us, it's just that, it's just words, right? So I think it's very interesting because as a student, these type of conversations, this is where I learn the most, because I feel like I can guide it in a direction that I want to go with my questions. But you as an expert, you have the information, you have the lived history, you have the knowledge to be able to inform us, but also adapt to the students that you're teaching. And this last question is connected to that thing you were saying about being able to take little risks in restructuring the culture as an educator. Do you think that as prospective teachers, we should be nervous about that? Because I know there's lots of people who have really big dreams, but then there's also lots of people who just are terrified to break up the status quo.
Yeah, it's a risk, definitely, especially if you're a beginning teacher. I mean, you're so vulnerable in so many ways, and I can tell you, Keaton, that those River Valley walks. Actually, I would say probably the most common group that I take on the walk are school staffs. So we have PD day, and the principal contacts me, and so they spend half a day in the River Valley with me. Mm-hmm. But this is a very common scenario. So the walk's over. I've stopped talking. We're all walking back to the parking lot, and there's a few people that's sort of saddled over towards me, and I can tell they want to talk about something. So we drop back a little bit, and eventually what I hear is, I really, really enjoyed what you had to share, and I think it's really important, but my principal would never support me in doing any of the things that you're talking about.
Right.
So that's very common. Leadership is so important for this kind of stuff because, of course, if people feel vulnerable, if they don't feel supported, then they're way less likely to experiment or try something that, is going to change things, right? And so, on the other hand, I have a good friend who's an associate superintendent for a school district in Alberta who asked me to help. And so here you have, one of the big bosses that's saying, hey, we need to do this. And so that changes everything. Mm-hmm. Now these teachers are like, okay, we have the green light. If there's any feedback from parents who don't like this, we can say, well, go talk to our boss there, So that's a factor that's really underrated that, I just want to acknowledge, is that if you're in a place where it's not safe for you for whatever reason to experiment, then yeah, I totally understand why you wouldn't be changing things. But I've been lucky. I never did teach in a public school setting. I only taught on a reserve school, and at that particular school, the superintendent was from the community, and anything that I wanted to do, she was fully supportive of. and so I had the green light to tinker, experiment, innovate, and that was a major thing for me. That is a big reason that I do what I do these days, because I had that support when I was beginning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I mean, from my side of things, I also think I could say that because you took the time out of your day to go through a couple scheduling mishaps and to still come on here and speak to us. So I appreciate that, because as an aspiring educator, I felt like this was something that I wanted to get my hands on in a way that I could truly connect with it. Because while I did clearly connect with the learning that I did from your content in my other courses, it was different because it was a group experience. But this is something that I feel comfortable with, and the fact that you were willing to take the time to come out here and do this with me, I genuinely appreciate it.
Yeah, and I appreciate the invitation and the conversation. It's always,
of course.
It's always good to hang out like this.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just check. One last question, because I'd like to tailor it to the area again at the end. How do you feel? Two things. First of all, how can Edmontonians who are not connected to the University of Alberta get their hands on the River Valley Walk? And then secondly, how do you feel like Edmontonians of the area can find other ways to connect with their area, with the place that they live, with the land, with life as a whole, as you put it?
So people who want to get a hold of me, it's just a simple email, Dwayne.donald@ualberta.ca. Over the years, people have said, well, you should create a website for the River Valley Walk and so on and so on. And I just don't have any interest in doing that. So if somebody wants to request a walk or they want to join a walk, then they send me an email and I just let them know when the next walks are coming up or when I'm available. And it just goes like that. It's just good to keep it simple like that. As far as Edmontonians are, connecting, I guess the way I've been mentored, Keaton, is like everything that I've been taught by, the wise ones, the ceremonial leaders, they do that because they want you to do it yourself.
Right.
So in other words, they don't share something just to show off how much they know or just to intellectualize it. They're telling you these things because they want you to make it part of yourself in your own way, to do it, right? To practice it. And so that's one thing that I've learned is when something is shared with me in that way, that if I'm going to honor it, I make it part of my life somehow, right? And so my hope with the River Valley Walk is that it inspires people to walk beside the river regularly. Mm-hmm. And of course, their goal, as you said earlier, is not to become me or try to be me, because they're not me, right? They haven't had my experiences. They're their own people. And so part of it is working out for themselves who they are, where their ancestors come from, but what that place has to do with them, and make their own connections. And this is something we do as part of some coursework that I do with one of the ceremonial leaders from Enoch Cree Nation. Is we ask people to study a place. Mm-hmm. So they choose a place outside and they visit that place for a whole trip around the sun. And they visit that place as often as they can. And one of the things that's so interesting about it is we don't actually tell them what to do there.
Right.
All we say is we want you to go there and pay attention to what you can learn, but you decide how to pay attention. You decide how to chronicle what you're learning. You decide how to share it with us. And so it's this real puzzle. And it's people always come up with very interesting ways to pay attention. But that's what we've learned, is that if it's really going to matter, it's the person, his or herself, or their self, that's going to have to sort this out.
Right. You can't, as a knowledge holder, at least in my opinion, what I've encountered is it's a lot easier being a guide as opposed to just a drill sergeant, because everybody is going to attach to their portion of your knowledge a different portion of your knowledge depending on who they are. And with that in mind, I think it makes the most sense to make it clear, this is how I see it, this is what I've learned, this is what I know to be true. But if you find what you know to be true and we can reconcile somewhere in the middle, that's where the true learning happens, right?
Yeah, and what you've just described is like a fundamental difference in how knowledge and knowing is understood, because in the first one, the focus is on information. And as we know, information for a long time has been currency, where the teacher holds that information and actually can control your ability to access it and your ability to get accreditation in order for you to continue on with your life goals, right? So it's like a gatekeeper relationship to information, as opposed to understanding knowledge and knowing in terms of wellness, in terms of being a real human being. And so the focus, instead of information, is on how I can enhance your well-being. Yeah. To me, that's a fundamental difference in that relationship to knowledge and knowing.
And I think I would go as far as saying, at least since we're on the topic, being an instructor, the well-being of your students, regardless of who you are and what you're teaching, has got to be at least in the top 3 priorities. Because for me, I knew when the teachers cared about the subject versus when they cared about us versus when they cared about both. You know, you can tell. And I think it's very interesting watching the teaching profession evolve as the newer generations come in, because hopefully we are paying respect to the knowledge, the mistakes that the older generations have made, but we also get to build something new with that knowledge and our own lived experience. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah. Tapwe, that's how you say, yeah, you're speaking the truth, man.
I appreciate it. I genuinely appreciate it. I don't want to hold you any longer. I genuinely could not thank you enough for the time that you've taken today, Dwayne. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't have the conversation in person. So hopefully in my last year, we can do that and have one outside, because I bought this windscreen for my microphone. I was all ready. I was going to make it happen. So hopefully we can make that happen in the future.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Awesome.
For sure.
And then for those of you listening, I genuinely appreciate the time you guys took to learn with us today. Obviously, there are no right answers in my esteem. I think you keep searching until you find knowledge that helps you in your everyday life. And I am really thankful that Dwayne was willing to take the time and teach to us, but also learn with us in this type of environment today. So thank you and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.